summer of 1945. World War II had ended, and American soldiers and American baseball players made their way back into America and into American life. Yankee slugger Joe DiMaggio wanted one day to be just simple baseball fan DiMaggio as he slipped into the mezzanine of the stadium with his 4-year-old son, Joe Jr. He wanted his son to have a normal baseball experience, eating peanuts and popcorn. Inevitably, though, a fan noticed him, and then another. And before too long, the whole stadium was chanting, "Joe, Joe, DiMaggio." So much more than normal ballgame. Well, he looked out at his younger son to see if he had noticed the tribute. He had. Little Joe DiMaggio said, "See, Daddy? Everybody knows me." In a lot of ways, we don't outgrow that childlike urge to want to be the center of attention. We want to be known like that, don't we? We want to walk into a room and have everyone recognize us. We want to be the one who people want to talk to at the parties. I venture to say that this is one of the reasons that we live in the world of the selfie. The self-taken picture with your cell phone. I'm sure that a lot of people in here have taken a selfie at one time or another. And to make matters more complicated, we now live in a world where selfie stick is a thing. Selfie stick is a long pole that allows you to attach your camera to the end of it so that you can get a better angle and include more people in your picture. Then we post these things to Facebook and Instagram so that we can see how many likes we can get, how many people will comment on how great our new haircut is or how great the party looked. We do this so that we can feel significant, so that we can feel important, so that we can be known. Unfortunately, though, sometimes our tendency to focus so much on ourselves translates into self-centered living. We're always focused on our desires, our hopes, our dreams. It turns into an obsessive self-love. We become the object of our own love story. Well, there's a love story from the Bible that I want to talk about today. It's from the book of Hosea. Hosea is the first of 12 minor prophets recorded at the very end of the Old Testament. And Hosea was told by God to marry a specific woman, Gomer. And so, being the obedient person that Hosea was, he went after Gomer. He pursued Gomer. He wooed her. He lavished extravagant gifts upon her, and eventually they married. But there was a problem. Like a lot of love stories, something went awry. And there's an allusion to it from the very first time that Gomer is mentioned in the text. Gomer is an adulterous woman. She lives a self-centered life. She continuously, throughout the narrative, leaves Hosea in pursuit of her own desires, her own whims, her own urges. But every time, the Lord tells Hosea to go and find Gomer. Go and find her, he says, and bring her back. Love her all the same, and in fact, love her even more. Think about your most significant relationship. For some of you, it might be a friend that you've made here while you've been at Southwestern. For others of you, it might be a parent or a spouse or a child. It's really important for us to have these significant relationships in our lives. It gives us a sense of belonging and the sense of importance that we long so deeply for. Through these relationships, we learn how to give and receive love. We learn that love is a goal, and love is always something that we are constantly moving toward. In the book of Hosea, Hosea's life is only a small part of the narrative in the first part of the book. Instead, the rest of the the book is a love story between Israel and God. The character of Gomer is an allegory for the people of Israel who were continuously unfaithful to God, who continuously went out on their own, followed their selfish whims, sacrificed to idols, and worshipped other gods. And this heartbreak that God felt is recorded in this book as the following. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the further they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals, or false gods, and burned incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Israel to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I had healed them. The Lord here is mourning the people's ignorance of his faithfulness in the past, of the provision that he has provided for his people, and their rebellion from that love now. I wonder if we, like the people of Israel, forget about God's unfailing love for us. Instead, consumed by our own desires and our own worlds, we continue on in the world to the detriment of our relationship with God. You see, before we even knew it, God was loving us through our parents, our family, our friends. And God loved us with a love that will not let us go. And this love that we received teaches us how to love one another. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, once said that the ultimate goal of the Christian life is to learn to perfectly love God and perfectly love our neighbor. It's a lofty goal, isn't it? Perfect love. God's love for us, though, encourages a response on our part, and that response is only possible by God's grace. Someone once said, we can't will ourselves to love. God gifts us with the ability to recognize love and the freedom to choose love. How we love shapes our decision-making and cultivates our attitudes, habits, and actions. So our starting point for loving others is God's love for us. So I ask us to consider, what do we know of God's love? What have we personally experienced of it? There's a Hebrew word for God's love, Hesed, which is much stronger than the English word for love. Hesed encompasses an understanding of God's love that is unshakable, that is unwavering, responsive, never-ending, everlasting. It's like the ocean, vast and grand and deep and wide, constantly moving and going back to the shore. This Hesed is what God felt for the people of Israel, even, and perhaps especially, when they were straying from God's ways. That Hesed is what brings God later in the book of Hosea to say the following. How can I give up on you, Israel? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I won't act on the heat of my anger. I won't return to destroy Israel. Just like the people of Israel, God loves us with an inextinguishable love that woos us toward a deep and significant relationship with God. This inseparable love goes on from everlasting to everlasting, and there is nothing that we can do to separate ourselves from it. However, there will in our lives undoubtedly be times when we can't feel God's love for us. Tough times in our life when we think the voice of God is silent. I know in my own life, when I graduated from graduate school and moved to Fort Worth for my first real job, I didn't know anyone. I was alone, and and a little lost. I had prolonged periods where I felt like God was silent, even when I cried out for help. But looking back on those times now, I realized that even when I was crying out to God for help, God was right there beside me, walking with me all along. I realize now that I have to remember that God promises to never leave us or abandon us. My experience with feeling distant from God at that point in my life now helps me lead other people through similar experiences. God uses the pain that I felt during those tough trials to help other people. My good friend and mentor often says, "No hurt goes unused." No hurt goes unused. God can use the pain in our lives to bring grace and love to people around us. As you embark on the rest of your life, graduates, you'll face difficulties, disappointments, disillusionments. But remember that God loves you with this Hesed love that only God can provide. Even when we turn away from God's love for us, God loves us all the same. Even when we turn away from God's love, God loves us all the same. And so, in the midst of these times of rightful celebration and merriment over the next couple of days, keep things in perspective. On Sunday, the celebrations will be over, and it will go back to life as normal. So, we're not the sole objects of the story that God is writing in our midst. Instead, we are recipients of God's Hesed, God's unfailing, never-ending, ever-present love to us. We are not the sole objects of the story that God is writing in our midst. Instead, we are recipients of God's Hesed, God's unfailing, never-ending, ever-present help, love to us. We are part of the larger story of God's redeeming love for all of creation. And what a story we have to share. Amen.